So with children's self-esteem, the most important part of self-esteem really is a child's initial connection to mom in the very earlier stages. So when we think about connection very early on, it has to be the way that the child feels both respected but also able to go to and approach a parent. So as we go on through the years, initially that connection with mom is going to be really important. So in terms of increasing self-esteem, mom or primary caregiver is really going to be responsible in doing that. So often we speak of positive affirmations. What that means is when you speak to your child, you don't want to make up fictitious rewards or affirmations or exaggerate how the child is doing, but you want to be able to point out their strengths. That often is much more important for self-esteem than being critical or trying to find fault in what the child is doing. So if we think about children at their very, very earliest stages, when you see them, for instance, putting blocks in that seems to be really strong in their tactile skills, comment on that. You're doing really good with that block. I've never seen you do that before. But you want to be really careful because the feedback that you give children, you want it to seem genuine. So if you say to your child, you're the best, most amazing child in the world, and they don't feel it's genuine, that actually works against self-esteem. So you want to be very factual, you want to be specific with what they're doing, and you want to do it regularly. That becomes really important. Now, as children get older and older, self-esteem really is going to be up to the parent, but also in their peer groups. So up until about the age of 7 to 10, the parent's primary relationship is going to be very important. After 10, usually what happens is that the peer groups become really important. So at that point, you want to really foster positive connections for your children. So for many, self-esteem comes from the feeling that I'm good at something. So you want to have them in groups, you want to have them in activities, you want to have them in things that are constructive with peers that can help them to develop themselves. So sports is one great way, music, arts. You want to have them in these type of activities to start to learn about themselves and what they're good at. By the time you get to the early adolescent years, you would hope that self-esteem is pretty strongly ingrained in your children, because by this point, the sense of self is pretty strong. The other thing that becomes really important in self-esteem is stability at the home front. So with both mom and dad, it becomes really important for them to see that sense of stability. So what that means is naturally in life, there's going to be transitions, migration, moving houses, moving schools. Those are natural adversities that children will be able to face very well. The ones that become really damaging to a child's sense of self is chaos, turmoil, conflict. To a certain degree, you want to try and maintain stability at home. So that's going to be really key for them as they get towards the early adolescent years for their self-esteem. I would say from probably when children can start to play, let's say 12 months, that's 6 months, up until I would say about probably 12, children explore through play. So any play-based activity where a parent can engage with children is probably the best way to really get a sense of your child's world. So I would say, depending on the child's interest. So if your child is young and likes trucks, you use trucks as your medium and you play. So this isn't about correcting. This isn't about fixing. This isn't about controlling. Those are the things you often want to stay away from in building self-esteem. When we focus on play, we're focusing exclusively on this idea of having them explore and use their imagination. So if it's dolls, you use dolls. If it's trucks, you use trucks. If it's nature, you take a walk outside. You have your child engage in curiosity in the earlier years because that's their biggest tenet to building their sense of the world. And as a parent, you're there basically for a safety mechanism. So they can look to you to say, what's safe in this world? And then they can go back to themselves and say, okay, I feel confident to explore. So as a parent, you're kind of a security guard or a safety guard, but use what your child is interested in to have them then explore their world, whatever their interests are. But I think in speaking of this, I'm very careful to say, based on their interests, try to contribute. So become an actor in their world. Try not to really stand on the outskirts. That will help them really in terms of seeing themselves and their autonomy in play. Play becomes the most important part of children's communication. So most often, if you want to build their self-esteem, it's not about talking to them. It's about engaging in play to get a sense of what their areas of strength are, but also their vulnerabilities will come up through actors, through different characters, and then you use those characters to then help them problem solve in the play environment that they've created for themselves. Think about our children often model us. So if you go through the world with zero vulnerability, zero weakness, I don't think that's a good example for children. I think what becomes really important to show your children, for instance, I'm not a good skater, but I really want to skate. Let's try this together. You show them to build skill and aptitude. That becomes really important. So I think for parents, for many parents, I would recommend try new things with your children. Show them to explore. What you want to show your children is basically that life isn't about doing something and doing it perfectly. It's about learning. That's what they're going to look at you for. So if you can foster that in the activities that they do, they then learn from you. Mommy is, or daddy, or grandma, auntie, uncle, maybe isn't 100% confident, but they tried and they had a really good time. That becomes important. In terms of, especially given the mosaic of Toronto and Canada, it is very multicultural. There is a lot of transition that happens in the moving to a new host country. What we know is, in terms of transitions, it takes about 7 years until full acculturation happens to a new host country. So what becomes really important in that time, I think, depending on the child of and the age that they're at, but what becomes really important during those years is to maintain open communication first. So what I mean by that is, depending on which part of the world you come from, culture, religion, gender roles, socioeconomic status, depending on how many of those variables will change once you migrate, naturally the transition will be harder. So if, for instance, you're coming from a country with a different religion, with a different culture, with different roles of men and women, the transition will naturally be harder than someone maybe coming from the US or the UK. So bear that in mind. The other thing is, once you do transition, especially from Middle Eastern countries, the research has shown that men often find it more difficult in that transition. So what that means is it often would be important, especially for family, to also connect to resources, because depending on how the family is doing, that will then trickle down to how the children are doing. So I don't think there's anything wrong with connecting to resources or supports within the community. Now, as for the children in that transition, I would say for parents to really try to be open-minded and to maintain the lines of communication. What I mean by that is, even if your children, you notice that the culture is different, the practices are different, what you want to do before the teenage years is have them be able to openly and freely discuss and communicate with you. Why that's going to be important is because up until that 12 age, you're going to be their primary model in the world. So you want to foster them coming to you, having open lines of communication, little judgment, a lot of understanding, because if you don't foster that by that age, after that age, their peers are going to be more influential than you. And if their peers are more influential, it can become a little bit unhealthy if they're not around the right peer groups. So I think for parents in the transition with their children, maintaining that connection to them at all stages in their development is going to be really important. So then as they get older, that connection that they have to them, they can maintain that, so then you will be their primary point of connection to the world. So then that way they come to you if they're feeling unsure about something. Now, for parents, I want to remind them that these are times when it's really important to practice being open, being listening. So as hard as it is to maybe want to give advice, want to correct, try and be a listener in your child's life, because then you are their primary connection and they'll come to you when they need things, rather than going to their peers that might sway them the wrong way or give them the wrong influences. Mm-hmm. So what I would say I think for especially for men, I would say families migrating, the ones I'm most concerned with, to be honest with you, are children in their teenage years and men. They're shown to be the ones that are most impacted by transitions, because you think about young children, they're able to pick up the language much faster. They're able to pick up the culture a lot quicker. As you go into the preteen years, into the early adolescence, language becomes harder to pick up. In terms of culture, it becomes harder to transition now to a new culture. So what I would recommend is for men, there's a lot of good organizations that have peer support groups. Depending on whether you're in York Region, in Toronto, whether you're in Peel, Halton, Durham, I would say any family service organization usually will have a men's support group. They'll also have family resources and counseling. So those would become really, really important, I think. The other piece for children, I would say, if your child is under the age of 12 and you've migrated, I would say at that point, talk therapy isn't very effective. They're probably going to need play therapy to kind of help them with this transition in the world. In terms of play therapy organizations, any child psychologist, psychotherapist that specializes in play would probably be a really good avenue for them to access supports and resources. Now, for a lot of the females coming in, there are early year centers. So early year centers, this idea of a caregiver, any caregiver, grandparent, mother, father, going into a center, and there's basically play objects, and a caregiver would primarily go in and engage in play with their child there. The reason this is really important is for someone who migrates, often resources are limited. So it would give them an opportunity to actually go into a center and meet other families, so to start forming other connections in their local areas. An early years center could be found in almost every area within Ontario. So that would be for early children, very young in age. That would probably be the best resource, I would say to them, to have their caregiver connect with others. Because what we know is, in terms of the benefits of even counseling, we know that if you were able to receive support from a peer, like another family going through this similar transition, that would actually be more effective than to go in, for instance, let's say for individual counseling. So that's why I often recommend for people to really access resources in their community. I would say to you, we know we call it attachment. What basically that means is later on it becomes self-esteem, later on it becomes success in life, and then being able to recognize failures and successes and growth. What we know about attachment is it's typically formed from birth, even I would say before birth, from the time children can hear in the womb. Often research has shown when children are born, they actually recognize their maternal voice. The reason that becomes important is that primary figure, typically we recommend a mother, but we also will say any consistent role model, whether mother, grandmother, father, preferably mother, that's there throughout, is going to be really important in that attachment. What attachment focuses on is the child's ability to come to you for support, and then from that support go into the world to then explore. What we know about that attachment relationship is that it's going to be the most important to foster with one person. So when we talk about that one person, you want it to be consistent. You want it to be regular. Ideally, if I could say in an ideal world, from 0 to 3, I would like that child to be exclusively with the mother and explore the world and have the mother provide them reassurance to then be curious about the world. Now, in every situation, the ideal isn't possible. So mom can't always be there to explore the world with the child. If mom isn't able to be there to explore the world with the child, what becomes really important is quality time. So what I mean by quality time is this is time in which it's focused exclusively on the child and their interests, not on cooking the meal, the child being on the floor or behind the TV. It means about spending, even in a day, an hour and a half, exclusively finding out about your child's world, what they're interested in, what they're learning about that day. And then through that, really being kind of a supporter and a contributor in that world that they have. The American Pediatric Society and the Canadian Pediatric Society has actually done research to look at screen time. Is it effective? Is it helpful for children's development? they have recommended, under the age of 2, 0 screen time. So a lot of parents, when I say this to them, will often look at me gasping. What do you mean? My child loves the iPad, the tablet. They watch all their cartoons on it. So in terms of development, from a developmental perspective, under 18 months has actually been shown to impact children negatively, any screen time. So what they've seen is in terms of language acquisition, being able to speak, in terms of memory, attention. Under 18 months, screen time actually delays and slows down children's development. Now, under 2 years of age, they recommend no screen time. Sometimes certain family members might be abroad, so you might Skype a family member. Parents might be out of town. In those situations, understandable to have children infrequently access connection through there. But that's probably the only situation that I can make exception for in terms of screen time. It really doesn't help them. In terms of a parent's connection to a child during that age, it helps them 20 times more. Just to show you in terms of the ratio of how much the interaction will help them build themselves as opposed to screen time. Now, as children get older, I would say up until the teenage years, the American Pediatric Society and Association has recommended 2 hours total. So when they say 2 hours total, that's screen time with laptops, iPads, social media, TV, computers. That's all together. When they've looked at young adults, especially with excessive screen time, and they've looked at how it impacts them, it actually impacts their school achievement. It impacts their ability to fall asleep. The bright LED lights from gadgets often alert the wake system in many of us. So many people who use it before bedtime will actually stay up because their system gets excited. So in a lot of teenagers, screen time is often limited before bed. In terms of attention deficit disorder, they've actually looked at children that have excessive screen time. And they've actually found that it actually contributes to learning disability later in life. There was actually a really good article by New York Times that spoke about this in terms of a lot of people are trying to push for the screen times, or parents are finding screen time is almost a babysitter or an outlet for their children. I would say that probably I would rather have them engage their child in the activities they're doing. So if you're a busy parent, you come home after work, you're trying to prepare dinner, instead of putting your child in front of a TV, a gadget, a tablet, I would rather have them in the kitchen with you, maybe not around the elements, but have them doing something that models what you're doing. Start teaching them that skill, whether it's stirring macaroni in a pot, whether it's naming objects that you're cooking and having them name the names, the colors, have them learn through appropriate developmental stages based on what you're doing. I would rather see children doing that.
Okay.
So I think it's a great question in terms of how do you help your children in terms of developing their curiosity with social media, but also protecting them, because I think every parent should protect their children initially when they start exploring the social media world. What I would say, I would strongly urge parents to have any social media or gadgets in a common area. For instance, having the family computer in the living room. Therefore, while they're engaged in these activities, you're there. You're present. I would strongly really urge against parents kind of putting computers, TVs in children's bedrooms. You give them access to this world that without much protection. I think the term helicopter parent, I think it often says a parent that's overly protective, that doesn't allow their child to build their self-esteem by exploring. So you don't want to be excessive there. However, your responsibility with kind of unleashing this world to your children of social media is protecting them. I would put gadgets in common areas, living rooms. I would have certain access times that the children can have. I would say before bedtime, gadgets aren't going to help with their sleep. I would strongly recommend not putting gadgets in their rooms or having access to their phones before they go to bed, if that's age appropriate. The other piece that becomes really important is provide your children with education on pictures to post, what type of content to be able to put out there. Because I also think part of it is once it goes out there, they're responsible for what's out there, and it sometimes can't be taken back. So I think that those discussions are also very important. Some parents that I work with will actually follow their children on their social media, will have access to their emails until a certain age, or will contract in terms of these are your responsibilities if you exclusively want access to your social media. These are the circumstances in which I will have to then have access to your account. So, and also really amongst your children's friends, build common networks, regularly connect, because I think children really do need a village to raise them. I really do believe in that concept. So it becomes really important for them to have multiple sets of eyes, kind of protecting them. What I would say is a parent's greatest investment in their child is the time that they spend with them. There's been research to look at children that go to private school. Do they benefit more than children that go to public school? Because parents are putting a lot of extra funds into their education. What the research has shown is what happens at home is the most important predictor of child's outcome. So what that means is the stability of mom and dad in terms of having respect for one another, engaging in dialogue regularly, having time with your children. Those are the factors that you're giving and investing in your children the most. A lot of parents think spending the day at home with their child might be sufficient. There's been a lot of research out there to look at happiness and being outside and being in nature. What happens in the home and for young children is they're very curious. They learn through experimenting. So if your experiment is just the house, you don't give them much to experiment with because things are predictable after a while. They know how the living room works. They know how the kitchen works. They know how their bedroom works. So you want to get them in nature to have them really start experimenting. So you want them to throw a rock. You want them to watch the leaves fall. You want them to step on grass, hear the sounds. That is going to be really important for their curiosity and for their development in nature. So what I would say is children will learn from us how to have conflict in the world. Can I say to somebody, including myself, don't have conflict? It's not possible. So in front of children, while I think there's two extremes. On one extreme, there's people that have chronic conflict, yelling, shouting, their inability to manage conflict. I think that's highly destructive for children. On the other hand, you have the two parents that are completely emotionally shut down and don't have any conflict in front of children. Both of these scenarios, you're not teaching children how to maneuver their world when they're not in agreement with someone. What I would say is if parents aren't able, if you're in one of these extremes and you're not able to have a constructive dialogue in front of your children, I would say try to refrain from having arguments. Or if an argument does happen, I would say have a secret word, have a keyword. A timeout becomes instrumental at that time. I think it's probably more destructive to have negative fighting in front of children than to have a timeout and show them that we don't discuss these things. So I would say if you're in one of those situations where you don't know how to speak to each other, I would say definitely try and hold back your conversations in front of your children. The marriage literature, what it shows is most often when someone comes into my office, out of those 100 couples that come into my office, 70% of them that have marital conflict have actually shut down. They're not engaging in communication. 30% of them, once I get them to start engaging, they're having those tense conversations. The 70% that aren't having conversations, the moment I get them to start talking, they're going to become very aggressive and argumentative to one another. Good. Okay. There's research on marriage and couples. There's the Gottman Institute. They're actually one of the most evidence-based schools of thought, and they've actually done 40 years of research into what makes couples last. They've looked at couples argue. They have a love lab, which they look at people argue and they try to look for what is it that helps couples and what is it that works against them. They have this term of the 4 horsemen. What they believe about the 4 horsemen is there's 4 ways in which the moment that you start having a disagreement, within the first 3 minutes of your argument, if you engage in any of these behaviors, most often the argument isn't going to pan out well, and the implications are going to be negative. For couples, when you get into a disagreement, what I often work with couples to start by doing is by not engaging in these 4 horsemen. The first one is criticism. You always do this. You never listen to me. Name calling. The moment you engage in criticism, you're actually shutting down the communication. Often, people that start criticism often will start off very harsh, very angry in the way that they approach arguments. For people that engage in criticism, an antidote, what we often recommend for them is to have a gentler startup, trying to express the situation, what their needs are, using a lot of I statements that can really help them not get so aggressive right away. The second one that a lot of couples engage is contempt. They'll roll their eyes, they'll cross their arms, they'll speak to the person as if they're above them. They'll speak to them with a lot of, as if they're to blame, they're angry with them. So for people that use a lot of contempt, we often recommend for them to start off their conversation by trying to build understanding, trying to understand what the other person is going through. Now, the third one, and this often happens for a lot of men often will get, in the moment of disagreement, will get very aroused physically. Their heart will start beating, they'll start sweating. They often will shut down. So they often will almost build a wall in front of them. So for people, we call this stonewalling. For men that do find themselves in a situation where they start feeling like they're shutting down, it becomes really important for them to take a few breaths and just really calm their nervous system down. Because so long as they're so aroused, they're not going to be able to engage. The last one, which a lot of couples will engage in, is your partner speaks to you. So for instance, I came home and the dishes were everywhere. I want you to clean up after yourself. And the partner gets defensive. Defensiveness right away stops communication and doesn't allow you to listen to the other. So for a lot of couples who get defensive the moment their partner starts speaking to them, it becomes really important for these couples to try to understand, to try and empathize with what their partner is trying to say to them. Most often, if I can help a couple by not engaging in these 4 tactics, in order to be able to actually listen to each other, to be able to speak using I statements and what their needs are of a couple and of their partner, it really helps to bring down the tension. Now, for some people, just having this discussion isn't enough. There might be historical events, historical things that have happened that cause them to get into these patterns. They then might need individual sessions where just engaging in these 4 tactics might not be enough. So what I would say is, in terms of the Gottman Institute, they've done a lot of research in terms of, they call it a love house. So they try, based on their 40 years of research, to look at what makes couples happy, what makes relationships lasting. So if you think about a house, usually they'll, on either side, the walls of the house, they'll describe as trust and commitment. So couples that have been, that have cheated, where there's big infidelities, often the commitment and the trust will be impacted the most. So those are the couples that often the walls of their house aren't even strong enough. So we often have to work with them on building that trust and commitment again. For many other couples, he really puts the 7 stages in his love house into 3 categories. The first category he defines as the friendship. So the friendship part of a relationship is getting to know each other, having fun, understanding your partner's history, their family, their desires, their needs. From that friendship, when we see couples that have strong friendships, they often are much easier when they try to resolve conflict. They don't look at each other as enemies. They look at each other as friends. So conflict becomes something they want to solve. Those couples often, we don't see them engaging in the 4 horsemen because they don't have that animosity. They don't have that tension. After the couples that do resolve conflict well and that do have a good friendship, from there they have larger life meaning. They speak about fulfilling each other's dreams. They know about each other's dreams. In therapy, these are the 3 stages that we're often helping couples to reinvent. What we know is after having a child, the first year is often when couples will often go through the most transition. This is the time when we'll see couples often come into my office, because the transition at this time is the most challenging. I think it's a really good question. What I would say is parents that migrate, whenever they migrate with their children, try and make home an environment where you practice your native tongue. Because once you practice your native tongue, it becomes so much easier for the child to build that confidence, because it's a practice that happens every day. Now, with parents that typically speak to their children in their native tongue, there are moments that really might not be so appropriate. So if the home becomes, let's say, for instance, your space of your native tongue, when you're out socially, maybe family events, cultural events, you could still practice your native tongue. Let's say you're in environments where the recipient on the other end isn't a native speaker in your country, in your native tongue. Those might be situations where it might be good also for the parent to practice the language of the country that they're in. Because at that point, you're practicing both languages. What you don't want to happen is to get into a situation where you're using one language too much and not using the other, for both parents and children, because that doesn't build their confidence in either language. So I think even for parents, sometimes it can often be much more difficult to learn the language than the children, because for them, they're learning at a later age. It's a harder habit. So for parents, they also want to practice which environments they want to use the language of the country they've immigrated to, because then that's going to build their confidence as well.
Thank you. Perfect.